بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وأسوتنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله. So tonight, inshallah, we're in our second or third reading now. Is this the third reading? It's the third reading of a small booklet. Again, we would call this a primer in traditional education, a small text meant to introduce students, young or old, into the basics of certain things they need to know. The book is called The Ladder of Success in Truly Loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Sulam al-Tawfiq ila Muhabbati Allahi ala al-Tahqiq. And this book was written for a very specific objective, which was to introduce to the reader everything they needed to know about their religion, both in terms of belief, theology, practice, so matters of fiqh, how to make wudu, how to pray, how to fast, etc., and also matters of the heart. And this is essentially modeling, he's structuring most of the context of the book around the hadith of Jibreel, which I think we mentioned before, when the Prophet ﷺ was asked about Islam, and he answered with the 5 pillars, and he was asked about Iman, faith, and he answered with belief in Allah and His angels and His books and His messengers and the last day, and also the divine decrees, the good of it and the bad of it. And he asked about Ihsan, which could be translated as excellence. It could also be translated as perhaps doing something beautifully. And he said that that you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see Him, and if you do not see Him, you know that He sees you. And that has a couple of meanings. The first of which is that we realize that Allah is holding us account and we're not hiding from Allah. So we can't like sneak, I can sneak away from you and do something haram, but I can't sneak away from Allah. I know that Allah is watching me. But maybe more, or as importantly, or maybe more significantly for us, that we might live beautiful lives, we might practice beautiful Islam, hoping to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've talked about this before, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above comparison to human beings, but we can understand in our human relationships, when we're children, we get an A+ on our exam, who do we want to show first? We want to show our parents. Why do we want to show our parents? Because we want to show them that we've done something wonderful, something beautiful, and we want them to be proud of us, right? So the idea that you would live a beautiful life, you would practice a beautiful Islam, hoping that Allah sees that and is watching you, and you can make Him, obviously we wouldn't say proud, but that you would do something that's pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is part of that meaning, right? So this is the objective of the book, that he covers these facets of the religion, inshallah, in a way that's meant to be easy. And we said this sort of text traditionally was very dense. It doesn't have a lot of proofs. He's not quoting verses from the Quran or hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. He's just giving you like bullet points, that this is what you need to know about Allah, this is what you need to know about the prophets and messengers ﷺ. This is what you need to know about your deen, this is what you need to do in terms of your wudu, for example. Very, very short bullet points for any age group. They can just take it 1, 2, 3, 4 and learn it that way, inshallah. So it's a little bit, if someone's never read a book like that, sometimes they want more. They want more information and more substance, but this is where we come in, inshallah, and hopefully we can add to some of that discussion, inshallah. So initially he talked about the shahadatain, what's required for Muslims to believe, and I'm not going to repeat all of that, inshallah ta'ala. Then he begins the next section by saying a summary of knowing Allah Most High. So a summary of what we need to know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said the summary of what preceded concerning the meaning of the first testimony of faith, which is the shahada, is to affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has these characteristics. So he mentioned a number of things, that Allah is the one, He's singular, He's the first, He's the living, subsistent, the endless, meaning without beginning, without end, the creator, the provider, the knowing, the able, and the one who does whatever He wills. Okay, that Allah has what we call volition, that He does whatever He wills. Okay, And whatever He wishes is to be, and what He wishes not to be is not. So he's going back to that point, and he's saying that these points in particular are an obligation for everyone to know about, even if they hadn't learned it in the Quran or Sunnah. That these things about Allah, that Allah is living, everyone has to know that if they're a Muslim. And every human being should understand that they have a creator who is alive, who has power, who has agency, who has volition, that he can do what he wills. These concepts are not just something that are found in the Quran and Sunnah, but something which the mind itself you can't picture a creator that doesn't have power. You can't picture a creator, you can't imagine that there's a creator of the universe that didn't have power to be able to do that. You couldn't imagine there's a creator, but he's not alive, right? It doesn't make sense, right? So he's saying those points in particular are necessary for everyone to know about. And this might be a small point for some of us. We might really not see the significance of why he's talking about that. But we'll give an example. So one of Allah's names is Ash-Shukur. We might translate that as what? Thankful, appreciative, grateful, right? And that's maybe not, right? So there was a brother that was here with you guys last week, Antonio, Allah yafadhu, who had just become Muslim days before, right? Or maybe the day before. If I asked him, does he know that Allah is Shukur? He would probably say no, he doesn't know that Allah is Shukur, necessarily. But he's still a Muslim. He's still a Muslim. His faith before he knew that particular name of Allah, he was still a Muslim. He just didn't know that Allah has told us that He's Ash-Shukur. Okay? But if you said, Antonio, do you know if Allah is alive or not? You can't say, oh, I don't know, I didn't know Allah was alive, I needed a proof from the Quran that Allah is alive. No, this is something which you have to believe in. You know, like the absence of that knowledge and understanding is an absence of a proper understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the point that there's an extreme deficiency that you would say this person has not really understood La ilaha illallah. Okay? But if you didn't know Shakur because you hadn't gotten to that part of the Quran, for example, that's not your fault, right? The same thing that he mentioned previously, the idea of heaven and hell, the idea of the life in the grave, that the grave can be a place of bliss or a place of punishment, that's not something you would know necessarily unless you found it in the Quran and Sunnah. We know it because Allah and His Messenger ﷺ told us about it. But if you didn't know about it, you're still a Muslim, right? But you just didn't happen to know about that thing. For us as converts, this happens a lot. We take the Shahada and then we learn, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. And there's a whole list of I didn't know that. But we were still Muslim. Because we affirmed the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we affirmed His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and what they told us is true, and we believe in their deen and we follow their path, right? That wholesale, we buy into the wholesale message that he gave us sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even if we don't know the details and we don't have really absolute knowledge of those things. We understand that whatever He gave us is about Himself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is true. So we follow, right? So this is kind of why he's getting into some of these points, inshallah. Then he mentioned something I think which is important. I mean, obviously everything here is important. He says, that the scholars have said that every responsible individual is specifically required to know these particular things, that Allah is alive, and he gives a list of them. That Allah is existent, that He's one, that He's beginningless, that He's endless, that He's absence of resemblance, meaning there's nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That He's absolutely self-sustaining, meaning no one or nothing is helping Him exist or causing Him to exist. He is existing because He's Allah. That He has ability, that He has will, that He has knowledge, hearing, seeing, or sight, life, and speech. These attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these are necessary for every Muslim to know. But then he says that we do not mean that we know them comprehensively in their true reality. when you say Allah is alive, well, you don't know what that means exactly. Like we're alive, but are we alive like Allah is alive? No, right? So that reality of Allah's attribute, we don't know the reality of it, but we know what enough of it to affirm it, right? So he says, but rather a limited knowledge that is appropriate to the limited capabilities of creatures. We're human beings, and our knowledge is limited, and our understanding is limited. For the entirety of creation is incapable of knowing the true reality of Allah Most High and His attributes. No one truly knows Allah except Allah. No one truly knows Allah except Allah. And the true realities of these things are as stated. So he mentions those things which I just mentioned, right? Then he says a really important part, and I'll read the Arabic as well, inshallah. I'm always staring at the clock, and the clock's staring me down. He says, تنبيه وصفات الألوهية لا تتغير فليست طارئة بل هي صفات لله بلا ابتداء لأن صفات الأزلي لا تكون إلا أزلية ولا شبه بين صفات الله وبين ما يسمي بأسمائها من صفات المخلوقات وإن كانت المعاني اللغوية لما يسمى باسمها من صفات المخلوقات تقرب لعقولنا فهم ما يمكننا فهمه عنها مع استحضار أنه ليس بين صفات الخلق وصفات الحق اشتراك أصلا ولا مشابهة بتاتا. So he says, the divine attributes do not change. Allah's attributes. So if He's all-knowing, He's always been all-knowing. He will always be all-knowing. There's that reality is part of Allah, and it doesn't change. If He's alive, He will always be alive. And this is our criticism of Christian theology, that you can say that God came down as a human being on the earth, and then He died on the cross. So you're saying God died? What are you saying? It doesn't make sense, right? So if Allah is all-knowing, He's always been all-knowing. This knowledge is absolute. Okay. Then he says, they do not happen. These are attributes which do not change and they do not happen. Rather, they are attributes of Allah without beginning, since the attributes of the beginningless are beginningless. There is no resemblance between the attributes of Allah and the attributes of creatures with the same names. So we say, okay, I'm merciful. What's the relationship between my mercy and Allah's mercy? Am I comparing my mercy to Allah's mercy in any way? Okay. This is what he's saying. Okay. Though the linguistic meanings of the attributes of created entities given their names do make it easier for our intellect to understand whatever is capable of understanding of these attributes, while bearing in mind that between the attributes of creatures and the attributes of Allah, there is no commonality to begin with or resemblance at all. What is he saying here? Even besides Allah's attributes, we can use even examples of heaven and hell. If I say that Allah has prepared hellfire, a fire, right? Well, is fire something that we would want to get or want to be in? No. Without the earthly meaning or the linguistic meaning of fire, we wouldn't understand that this is something which we're trying to avoid. If without the earthly meaning of fire, we wouldn't realize that this is something we want to avoid. The same thing, mercy. Is mercy something we want? It is something we want. So if we didn't know the human meaning of mercy, we couldn't understand that it's something desirable and something we should work towards. Does that make sense? That's the limit of what these things mean in comparing Allah to His creation. That's it. You can't say oh, it's a matter of degrees. I'm merciful. Allah is just really much. He's just really, really more merciful than I am. No. It's not the same thing. But from the word mercy, you understand that it's something beautiful and something desired, and it's something hoped for with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we didn't have the human linguistic meaning, we wouldn't know we wouldn't have any indication that it's something desirable with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The same thing, punishment, etc. So that's what he's trying to say, right? Alhamdulillah. So then he mentions, okay, the things which we are not allowed to believe in Allah. Essentially the opposite of what he had mentioned before, that if Allah is alive, it's impossible for us to reconcile that or to conceptualize Allah as being dead, right? Like I said, if Allah is one, it's impossible to conceptualize that He's more than one, or three in one, right? For example. Or that Allah has a beginning. If we say He's beginningless, these are kind of understanding, right? So He mentions them: non-existence, multiplicity, origination, termination, resemblance, need, inability, being compelled or lacking volition, meaning someone is forcing him to do something or he's doing something that he doesn't want to do, ignorance, deafness, blindness, death, and muteness, meaning the inability to speak. These attributes are, and we would say, impossible, and believing in them is completely against the Quran and Sunnah first and foremost, but also against complete, like any rational understanding of a divine being, right? Alhamdulillah. 2 more minutes, inshallah. Ooh, okay, this is good. Okay. So we'll read this and then we'll stop, inshallah. Do you guys want the Arabic? I know you want the Arabic, right? You see, my Arabic reading is tough, it's hard. So he said, a responsible individual is required to know the general proof for the existence of Allah Most High and His attributes in order to safeguard his faith. So you as a believer, you believe in Allah, but you should understand the proofs. Like, why do you believe what you believe? Is it because your parents taught you, or is there something you have a stronger proof than that? You should know what those proofs are to defend your faith against that. And now we're living in a time where faith, and not just Islam, but faith in general, is deemed to be barbaric and like backwards, medieval. This is something that ancient peoples did who didn't know any better. They didn't know about science and all this stuff, and so they had all these superstitions. And that you believe in an afterlife. How could you believe in an afterlife, right? So it's important for us to understand why we believe what we believe. And what the scholars did in later periods, and he's kind of leaning into that tradition, is they, besides relying on just the Quran and Sunnah as evidence, they relied on rational arguments. So I can quote you a Quran and Sunnah, but if you tell me I don't believe in Quran and Sunnah, what's my proof after that? What proof do I have? How can I argue with you? So the scholars used rational, logical arguments to prove the existence of Allah, the existence of a creator, that this universe, we're sitting here, how the heck did we get here? Did we just pop into existence and then we'll just pop out of existence? Nothing just pops into existence. Nothing comes from nothing. Something had to cause this to be. What caused all of this to be? So there's rational arguments, and they're not weak arguments. And the scholars would say that there's no contradiction between reason and religion. There's no contradiction. There's no conflict between reason and religion. And that's something which a lot of people, this is the time that we're living in, that religion is really being tested and faith is really being tested. So he gives an example. So he says, an example of this is someone saying to himself or to herself, I came into my mother's womb after having not existed. And what exists after not existing must have something that produces it. It must have a cause, meaning a creator who produced and formed it. So there must be a creator who created my limbs and my parts and my internal and external attributes. That former, in a creator who formed me and produced me is not my father or my mother or any other creature. Well, the biologist would say, yeah, it was your father and mother. But why is he saying it's not my father and mother? He's saying it's not my father and mother because my own father and mother they're in the same condition that I'm in. They had a point in time where they didn't exist and they came into existence. So if they came into existence, something had to cause them to come into existence. What is it that caused them to come into existence? So this is called tasassul, right? Like we have this going back forever and ever. There had to be a cause, an initial cause. The best the scientists can say is what? The Big Bang. That's the best they can say. Something exploded. The Big Bang. هو البيج بانج بالعربي ايه؟ بالعربي القنبلة الكبيرة والانفجار الكبير ايه؟ ها؟ البومبا. Allah musta'an, right? So then he says, Rather, it is immense and is an immense creator. It created everything that exists in the cosmos, and it has complete control over each of its atoms. It is a singular deity without partner or peer. It is unblemished without any deficiency. It has absolute perfection without limitation. It must be described with knowledge, ability, will, life, and all other attributes of perfection that fit the divine. The minds of created beings cannot have comprehensive knowledge of it. In Arabic, we call it Allah. Okay, so he's giving you an understanding that this is one example. He's giving one example of a believer sitting down and asking themselves, you know, besides the Quran telling me that I have a creator, or the Prophet ﷺ telling me I have a creator, do I know in myself, and do I observe in the universe that this has a purpose, this has a cause, right? And alhamdulillah, the scientists, at least they admit that the universe has a beginning. Alhamdulillah, so we're on the same page, right? The universe has a beginning. Well, something does not come from nothing. And we're all sitting here having a conversation. And it couldn't have been by some supposed accident, huh?
Isn't that the minimum gene theory that the scientists look at? Basically, there was an initial set of genes that became, into further developed organisms. Like, had to be something start, so somebody or something had to put that initial set of genes, or it would have never evolved. So,
I mean, the Quran itself gives the reasons. You know, he says, look at the creation around you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Look at the heavens and look at your own self.
Yes.
I mean, talking about genes, right? Genes are very complex, right? Look at the seed. Okay? Can anybody make a seed with all the genetic stuff? ShopRite will have no food. Right? So look at the, Quran itself tells us the argument to use our reason. Look at the creation around you. Right? So looking at the creation, you look at everything is so systematic, so well organized. Look at the bacteria, the viruses, all these stuff happening in their own, they have their own rules, right, which God has made. So how can you deny that this thing is some random process?
yeah, that's the point, exactly.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So we find this in our tradition that later scholars of theology, they started to lean into rational arguments to support the Quran and Sunnah, not in opposition to or in place of the Quran and Sunnah, but to support what we see in the Quran and Sunnah of our theology, our belief system, that all of this had a beginning, and just as it has a beginning, our belief is that all of this will also have an end. And plenty of scientists would tell you that looking at the earth and looking at the sun one day is going to burn out. The sun one day is going to burn out, and life on earth is going to change, right? The idea that life could stop is not unscientific either, right? So this is our belief. The universe had a beginning and it will have an end. Then we will all return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is part of our tradition and scholarship. We see scholars discussing those things for the sake of pointing to the fact again that there's no contradiction between reason and science, or reason and faith. Reason and faith. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop here, inshallah ta'ala. There's a few more things he mentions about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then he gets into some of our beliefs about the prophets and messengers. Alhamdulillah. So he has a section, it's another maybe 20 pages, and then he gets into the fiqh issues. So how to pray, how to fast, etc. Again, for a lot of you guys, this is super easy. You're like, if I give you an exam on this stuff, you're all going to get A+, no problem. But it's good that we, as a community, it's good to read these simple things, and then we can build later off of that, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa akhir da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum.